I came home from the hospital with stitches in my side and found my apartment already unlocked. At first, I thought maybe I'd forgotten. Then I stepped inside. Drawers were open, closet doors hanging wide. My bedroom looked like someone had been searching for something they thought belonged to them. And on my kitchen counter, like a signature, was my mother's favorite coffee mug. She had let herself in while I was lying in a hospital bed. No call, no permission, no shame. Just another reminder that in her mind, nothing I owned was ever really mine. But what she didn't know was that she hadn't just invaded my apartment. She had walked straight into the one secret I'd spent years protecting. And the second I realized what she might have found, I knew everything was about to explode. I stood there in my own doorway, keys still in my hand, the door swinging open like an invitation I never gave. My side was throbbing from the surgery. The painkillers were wearing off, and all I wanted was to collapse into my own bed and pretend the last 72 hours hadn't happened. But the universe had other plans. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Not my smell, the lavender and vanilla candles I always burned. No, this was different. It was coffee, old coffee, and something else, something floral, perfume, her perfume, my mother's perfume. My heart didn't race, it stopped, completely, like someone had reached inside my chest and just squeezed. Because I knew. I knew before I even walked past the kitchen. I knew before I saw the drawers hanging open like wounded animals. I knew before I saw my closet doors spread wide, my clothes shoved to one side like they were in the way. I knew. And yet I still walked forward, because what else was I supposed to do? Turn around? Go back to the hospital? Pretend my mother hadn't just broken into my home while I was unconscious in a sterile room with tubes coming out of my arm? No. I had to see. I had to know what she took. But more than that, I had to know what she found. Because hidden in this apartment, in a place I thought no one would ever look, was the truth. The real truth. About her, about my family, about everything. And if she had found it, God help us all. I walked slowly. Each step sent a small shockwave of pain through my lower abdomen. The doctor said no heavy lifting for 6 weeks. He didn't say anything about dealing with a mother who had no boundaries and a talent for destruction. The living room looked mostly fine. The couch was untouched. The TV was still there. My laptop sat on the coffee table exactly where I left it. That was the thing about my mother. She wasn't of deef, not in the traditional sense. She didn't want my TV. She didn't want my laptop. She didn't want money. She wanted information. She wanted control. She wanted to know everything about my life so she could use it against me later. That's what she'd always done. That was her gift, her superpower. Finding the soft spots and pressing her thumb into them until you screamed. The kitchen was worse. Every cabinet was open. Every drawer was pulled out and dumped on the counter. Spoons and forks scattered like fallen soldiers. My spice rack had been taken apart, each bottle lined up on the counter like she was inspecting them. And there it was. The mug. Her favorite mug. The one she'd given me for Christmas 3 years ago. It said, "World's okayest mom," in sarcastic letters. I'd never used it. I'd thrown it in the back of the cabinet behind the chipped mugs and the cups from college I never touched. But she'd found it. She dug through my cabinets until she found the one thing in my kitchen that belonged to her. And she'd left it out, like a flag, like a message. I was here. You can't stop me. Everything you have is mine. The rage started building in my chest. Not the hot, explosive kind, the cold kind. The kind that freezes your blood and sharpens your thoughts until every idea feels like a blade. I turned toward the bedroom. That's where she would have gone. That's where the real search would have happened. My mother didn't care about my kitchen or my living room. Those were just diversions. The bedroom was the target. The bedroom had secrets. The bedroom had my locked box.
The bedroom had the file. I limped down the hallway, one hand on the wall to steady myself, the other pressed against my stitches. The pain was nothing compared to what I felt in my chest. That was terror, pure animal terror. The bedroom door was already open. I pushed it wider and stepped inside, and I wanted to throw up. My dresser drawers were pulled out and dumped on the floor, socks and underwear scattered everywhere. My nightstand had been emptied, the top drawer yanked out and thrown on the bed. My phone charger was still plugged into the wall, but the cord had been ripped from my phone and coiled up like a snake. My closet was the worst. All my shoes had been pulled from their boxes and thrown in a pile. My winter coats were on the floor. My suit bags had been unzipped and searched. And the top shelf, the shelf where I kept my box, was empty. The box was gone. I felt my knees buckle. I grabbed the doorframe to keep from falling. My vision blurred, not from pain, from panic.
Because that box wasn't just a box. That box was years of proof. Bank statements, emails, screenshots, recordings, photographs, everything I'd gathered since I was 18 years old. Everything I'd hidden because I wasn't ready, because I was scared, because I thought maybe, there was still a way to fix things without destroying her. But she'd found it. She'd taken it. And now she knew. She knew that I knew. She knew that I'd been watching, waiting, collecting. She knew that her perfect little victim wasn't so little anymore. I slid down the doorframe and sat on the floor, surrounded by the wreckage of my own home, and I laughed. Not because anything was funny, because it wasn't, because everything was about to get so much worse. And the worst part? She didn't even know the full story. She thought she'd won. She thought she'd found my secrets and taken them away. She thought she'd stolen my power. But that box was nothing. That box was a decoy. The real truth, the thing I'd been protecting for years, wasn't in a box on a shelf. It was somewhere she'd never think to look. And now I had no reason to hide it anymore.
To understand why my mother breaking into my apartment felt like a declaration of war, you have to understand who she is, and more importantly, who she trained me to be. My mother's name is Diana, and Diana has never been wrong about anything. That's not an exaggeration. That's not me being dramatic. That is a fact of life in our family. Diana says something, it becomes truth. Diana makes a decision, it becomes law. Diana feels something, everyone around her has to feel it too, or else. I grew up in a house where my mother's moods controlled the weather. If she was happy, the sun shined. If she was angry, thunder cracked. If she was sad, the whole world had to grieve with her. And if you didn't match her energy, if you dared to be happy when she was angry, or calm when she was sad, you were punished. Not physically, not in ways that left marks. My mother was too smart for that. She punished with silence, with cold shoulders that lasted for days, with whispered comments to my father when she thought I couldn't hear, with disappointment that hung in the air like smoke. "You're so selfish. After everything I've done for you. I guess I'm just a terrible mother." That was her favorite line. I guess I'm just a terrible mother. She'd say it with this little smile, this sarcastic tilt of her head, and somehow I'd always end up apologizing, even when she was the one who'd hurt me, even when she was the one who'd crossed a line. I'd apologize, I'd beg, I'd promise to be better. And she'd forgive me, graciously, like she was doing me a favor. That was our relationship for 18 years. But things changed when I turned 19. That's when I found the first lie. It started small, a credit card bill that came to my apartment, my first apartment, the tiny studio I'd rented after leaving for college. The bill was addressed to me, but the charges weren't mine. Someone had opened a card in my name. Someone had been using it for months. Someone had maxed it out and never made a single payment. I called the credit card company in a panic. I told them it was fraud. I told them I'd never opened this account. I gave them my social security number. I gave them my birth date. I gave them everything. And the woman on the phone got very quiet.
"Ma'am," she said, "this account was opened when you were 17. The application lists your mother as an authorized user." My blood turned to ice. I asked for the address on the account. She gave it to me. My parents' address, the house I grew up in. I asked for the phone number, my mother's cell phone. I asked for the email address, my mother's email. And then I hung up, and I sat on the floor of my studio apartment, the one I paid for with money from my part-time job, the one my mother told me I couldn't afford, the one she said I'd fail out within 6 months, and I cried. Not because of the money. The card was only maxed at $2,000. That wasn't nothing, but it wasn't life-changing either. I cried because of what it meant. My mother had stolen my identity. My mother had opened a credit card in my name. My mother had used it for months, let the debt pile up, let my credit score tank, and never said a single word. And then I thought about all the other things. The bank account my parents had opened for me when I was born, the one they said was for college. I'd never seen a statement. I'd never been given access. I just trusted them. That was when I started digging.
It took me 3 years to uncover the full truth. 3 years of late nights, locked doors, and private computer screens. 3 years of pretending everything was fine while I collected evidence like a detective building a murder case. Because that's what it felt like. A murder. Not of a person, of trust, of safety, of the illusion that my mother loved me more than she loved control. The credit card was just the beginning. There was a second card, then a third, then a car loan I never signed for, then a student loan that was supposed to pay for my tuition, but had been cashed out and deposited into an account I didn't recognize. By the time I turned 22, my credit score was in the 400s. I couldn't rent an apartment without a cosigner. I couldn't get a car loan. I couldn't even open a new bank account without jumping through hoops. And my mother? My mother was living in a renovated kitchen, a new car, vacations to Florida twice a year. She was living on my future, and she never said sorry. Not once. Not even when I confronted her. "Do you know what I've sacrificed for you?" she'd said when I finally worked up the courage to ask about the credit cards. "Do you have any idea what it costs to raise you, to feed you, to clothe you? You owe me, sweetheart. This is just repayment." Repayment. She called it repayment, like I'd taken out a loan I never agreed to, like my childhood was a debt I owed, like being born into her family meant signing away my financial future. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry. I wanted to call the police and report her for fraud. But I didn't, because she was my mother, and somewhere, deep down, some pathetic, desperate part of me still wanted her to love me, still wanted her to look at me and see a daughter, not a resource. So I did the only thing I could do. I started planning. First, betrayal signs. Looking back, the signs were always there, even before the credit card, even before the identity theft. The signs were there from the beginning, woven into the fabric of my childhood, like threads of poison in a beautiful tapestry. I was 7 years old when I learned that my mother's love had conditions. We were at a family party, my cousin's birthday. There was cake and ice cream and one of those bouncy castles that all the kids were obsessed with. I was having the time of my life. I'd just made a new friend, a girl named Sophie who'd moved in down the street. We were holding hands and jumping together and laughing so hard I thought I might pee my pants. Then my mother pulled me aside. "Stop showing off," she whispered, her fingernails digging into my arm. "I'm not showing off," I said. "I'm just playing." "You're making me look bad. Everyone's looking at you. Stop it." I didn't understand. I was 7. I wasn't trying to make anyone look bad. I was just being a kid, having fun, being happy. But to my mother, my happiness was a threat, because if I was happy without her, if I was having fun without her permission, without her involvement, then what did that say about her? So I stopped jumping. I stopped laughing. I sat in the corner and watched Sophie bounce alone, and I felt something inside me crack. That was the first time. There were so many more. When I was 10, I got the lead in the school play.
I thought she'd tell me how amazing I was. She didn't. Why would you want to do that? She asked, frowning at the paper like it had personally offended her. Because I like acting, I said, because I'm good at it. You're not that good, she handed the paper back to me. And you have other responsibilities. You can't be at rehearsal every day. Who's going to watch your brother? Who's going to help with dinner?
She didn't speak to me for 3 days. 3 days of silence. 3 days of walking on eggshells. 3 days of my father looking at me with pity in his eyes and not saying a word in my defense. On the 4th day, she acted like nothing had happened. She made me breakfast. She asked about my day. She smiled like the past 72 hours had never existed. And I let her, because that was easier, because fighting back meant more silence, more cold shoulders, more nights spent crying into my pillow, wondering what I'd done wrong. So I worked at the coffee shop, I saved my money, I made plans. And I never told her how much I was really making. That was my first secret, the first brick in a wall I'd spent years building. Conflict gets worse. The credit card discovery should have been my breaking point. It should have been the moment I walked into a police station and ended her reign of control forever. But it wasn't, because my mother had one final card to play, one weapon I hadn't anticipated. My father. After I confronted her about the credit cards, after she'd used every manipulation tactic in her arsenal to make me feel like the villain, my father called me, not to apologize, not to defend me, not to finally take a stand for his daughter, to beg. Please don't report her, he said. His voice was shaky, old. He sounded smaller than I remembered. She's not well. You know she's not well. If you do this, it will destroy her. It will destroy all of us.
I can still help with dinner. Rehearsals are right after school. I'll be home by 5. You're being selfish. That word again. Selfish. My mother's favorite weapon. Anytime I wanted something for myself, anytime I tried to be my own person, I was being selfish. I didn't do the play. I stayed home. I watched my brother. I helped with dinner. And I told myself that my mother was right, that I was selfish, that wanting things was bad. It took me years to unlearn that lie, and by the time I did, the damage was already done. The summer I turned 16, I got my first real job, a coffee shop downtown, minimum wage plus tips. It wasn't much, but it was mine. My money, my time, my independence. My mother hated it. You don't need to work, she said. We give you everything you need. I want to work. I want to save money for college. College is covered. By what? The question slipped out before I could stop it. My mother's eyes went cold. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. What did you say? Nothing. I didn't mean... You're accusing me? You're standing in my house, eating my food, wearing my clothes, and you're accusing me? I'm not accusing you. I just asked. I've given you everything. Everything. And this is how you think me? With questions? With attitude? She didn't speak to me for 3 days. 3 days of silence. 3 days of walking on eggshells. 3 days of my father looking at me with pity in his eyes and not saying a word in my defense. On the 4th day, she acted like nothing had happened. She made me breakfast. She asked about my day. She smiled like the past 72 hours had never existed. And I let her, because that was easier, because fighting back meant more silence, more cold shoulders, more nights spent crying into my pillow, wondering what I'd done wrong. So I worked at the coffee shop. I saved my money. I made plans. And I never told her how much I was really making. That was my first secret, the first brick in a wall I'd spent years building. The credit card discovery should have been my breaking point. It should have been the moment I walked into a police station and ended her reign of control forever. But it wasn't, because my mother had one final card to play, one weapon I hadn't anticipated: my father. After I confronted her about the credit cards, after she'd used every manipulation tactic in her arsenal to make me feel like the villain, my father called me, not to apologize, not to defend me,
not to finally take a stand for his daughter, to beg. "Please don't report her," he said. His voice was shaky, old. He sounded smaller than I remembered. "She's not well. You know she's not well. If you do this, it will destroy her. It will destroy all of us."
She destroyed me, Dad. She wrecked my credit. She stole from me. She's been lying to me my whole life. I know she has, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But please, think about your brother. Think about me. Think about what happens to this family if you go to the police. And there it was, the trap. Because he was right. Reporting my mother wouldn't just hurt her. It would hurt everyone. My dad would lose his wife. Not that he had much of one to begin with. My little brother would lose his mother. Not that she was much of a mother to him either. The family would implode, and I would be the one holding the match. So I did nothing. I told myself I was being compassionate. I told myself I was protecting my family. I told myself that this was the right thing to do. But really, I was just scared. Scared of my mother's rage. Scared of her silence. Scared of being cut off from everyone I loved. So I let it go. I froze my credit. I disputed the charges. I paid off the debts I could afford and let the others fall into collections. I rebuilt my credit score 1 point at a time, and I started collecting evidence.
Not because I planned to use it, not because I wanted revenge, because I needed proof. Proof that I wasn't crazy. Proof that I wasn't the selfish, ungrateful daughter she always said I was. Proof that my pain was real. I saved every email, every bank statement, every credit report. I took screenshots of conversations. I recorded phone calls. I even started keeping a journal, a detailed log of every lie she told, every manipulation she used, every boundary she crossed. I called it my insurance. And for 5 years, that's all it was. Insurance I hoped I'd never need. But the thing about people like my mother is that they can't stop. They can't help themselves. The more you give, the more they take. The more boundaries you build, the harder they push. I moved out at 19, but my mother never really let me go. She'd show up unannounced, let herself in with the key I never gave her, the one she'd copied without asking. She'd rearrange my furniture, throw away clothes she didn't like, read my mail, go through my phone if I left it unattended. Every time I confronted her, she had the same response. "I'm your mother. I'm allowed to worry. I'm just trying to help. You're so sensitive. I did this because I love you." Love. She said that word so often it lost all meaning. Love to my mother wasn't about sacrifice or support or showing up when it mattered. Love was control. Love was ownership. Love was the excuse she used to justify every violation. And I was so desperate to believe that someone loved me that I let her get away with it. Until I couldn't anymore. The surgery was supposed to be routine, a minor procedure, in and out in a few hours. I told my mother about it 2 weeks ago, partly because I felt obligated, partly because I was secretly hoping she'd offer to help. She didn't offer to help. She told me I was being dramatic. She told me I didn't need surgery. She told me I was wasting money on doctors who just wanted to line their pockets. Then she asked if she could borrow $500. I said no. She didn't speak to me for a week. When she finally called back, it wasn't to apologize. It was to tell me that she'd been pinking, and maybe I should postpone the surgery. Maybe I should wait until she had time to drive me to the hospital. Maybe I should consider her feelings for once. I hung up. I stopped answering her calls. I went to the hospital alone. And while I was lying in that bed, unconscious, with tubes in my arm and stitches in my side, she broke into my apartment. That's who my mother is. Not someone who loves me, someone who sees my vulnerability as an opportunity. Major reveal. The box was gone. That was my first thought as I sat on my bedroom floor, surrounded by the wreckage of my own life. The box was gone, and everything in it, the credit reports, the bank statements, the screenshots, was now in my mother's hands. She knew. She knew that I knew.
She knew that I'd been collecting evidence against her for years. She knew that her perfect victim wasn't so perfect anymore. For a few terrible minutes, I panicked. I imagined her destroying everything, burning the papers, deleting the files, erasing the evidence like it had never existed. But then I remembered. The box was a decoy. The real evidence, the real secrets, weren't in a box on a shelf in my closet. They were somewhere else, somewhere my mother would never think to look. Because I'd learned from her. I'd learned to hide things in plain sight. I'd learned to keep my secrets close and my lies closer. And the biggest secret of all, the one I'd been protecting since I was 19 years old, wasn't about credit cards or identity theft or stolen money. It was about my father.
See, here's the thing about my father. For years, I thought he was a victim too. Just another casualty of my mother's need for control. A good man trapped in a bad marriage. Too scared to leave, too beaten down to fight back. I felt sorry for him. I made excuses for him. Every time he stayed silent while she screamed at me, I told myself he was just trying to keep the peace. Every time he watched her manipulate and lie and destroy, I told myself he didn't know what else to do. Every time he chose her over me, I told myself he didn't have a choice. I was wrong. My father wasn't a victim. He was a partner. And 18 months before my mother broke into my apartment, I found proof. It started with an email. An old email buried in my mother's account. I'd hacked into it years ago, desperate times, desperate measures, and set up a forwarding rule so I'd receive copies of everything she sent and received.
I know that sounds extreme. I know it sounds like something my mother would do. And maybe it was. Maybe I'd become more like her than I wanted to admit. But I don't regret it, because that email changed everything. It was sent from my father to my mother, dated 3 years before I found the first credit card. The subject line was a single word: done. The body of the email was even shorter. Social security number and birth date are correct. Account should be approved within 48 hours. Don't use this one for anything big. Keep it under 2,000. That was it. That was the moment I realized my father wasn't innocent. He wasn't ignorant. He wasn't being manipulated or controlled or abused. He was an accomplice. He'd helped her open that first credit card. He'd provided my social security number. He'd coached her on how to avoid detection. And he'd been helping her ever since.
I couldn't believe it at first. I read the email a dozen times, looking for some other explanation. Maybe I'd misinterpreted. Maybe the account was for something else. Maybe my father didn't know what my mother was planning. But the evidence kept piling up. More emails, more instructions, more proof that my father wasn't just aware of my mother's crimes. He was actively participating in them. He helped her open the second credit card. He helped her forge my signature on the car loan. He helped her cash out the student loan and deposit the money into their joint account. Every lie, every theft, every betrayal, he was right there beside her. And all those years I'd felt sorry for him, all those years I'd made excuses for his silence, his weakness, his refusal to protect me, he didn't deserve any of it. He was just as guilty as she was. And the worst part? He knew I knew. Because 6 months after I found that first email, I confronted him.
We were alone. My mother was at work. My brother was at school. I drove to my parents' house and found my father in the garage, tinkering with some old tool he'd never actually fix. I know about the emails, I said. His hands stopped moving. What emails? The ones you sent to Mom, about my social security number, about the credit cards, about everything. He didn't turn around, didn't look at me, just stood there, frozen, like a deer in headlights. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't. My voice cracked. I was trying so hard to be strong, but my heart was breaking into a million pieces. Don't lie to me. Not you. Not you too. He finally turned around.
His face was pale. His eyes were wet. And for a moment, just a moment, I thought he might apologize. I thought he might finally tell me the truth. Instead, he said, "Your mother is going to kill me." That was it. Not, "I'm sorry," not, "You're right," not, "I was wrong." "Your mother is going to kill me."
Because even in that moment, even when he'd been caught, even when his lies were exposed, his first thought wasn't about me. His first thought wasn't about the damage he'd caused or the daughter he'd betrayed. His first thought was about himself. And that's when I stopped loving my father. I didn't report them, not then. I was still too scared, still too broken, still hoping that maybe, somehow, things could get better. But I stopped pretending they loved me. I stopped showing up to family dinners. I stopped answering their calls. I stopped pretending that everything was fine. And I started planning. Because if they were going to steal my future, I was going to steal theirs. Sitting on my bedroom floor, surrounded by the wreckage of my apartment, the pain in my side felt like nothing compared to the pain in my chest. My mother had taken my box. My mother had taken my evidence. My mother had taken everything I'd spent years collecting. And I had nothing left. Or so I thought. I must have sat there for an hour. Maybe longer. I don't really know. Time stopped making sense. All I could feel was the cold floor beneath me, and the hot tears on my face, and the dull throb of my stitches, reminding me that my body was just as broken as my heart. I thought about my childhood, about all the times I'd begged for my mother's love and received her control instead, about all the times I'd made excuses for my father's silence and received his betrayal instead. I thought about the money, the thousands of dollars they'd stolen, the opportunities they'd destroyed, the future they'd tried to steal. I thought about the emails, the bank statements, the screenshots, the proof I'd gathered so carefully, tucked away in a box that was supposed to be safe. And I thought about how stupid I'd been, how naive, how desperate, because for years I'd held on to this fantasy that one day they'd see what they'd done. One day they'd apologize. One day they'd love me the way I'd always wanted to be loved. But that day was never coming. My mother didn't break into my apartment because she loved me. She broke in because she was afraid of me. Because somewhere, deep down, she knew that I knew the truth. And she wanted to destroy the evidence before I could use it. That's what finally woke me up. Not anger, not revenge, not even sadness. Clarity. The kind of clarity that only comes when you've hit rock bottom and realized there's nowhere to go but up. My mother thought she'd won. She thought she'd taken my power. She thought she'd silenced me forever. But she was wrong. Because the real evidence wasn't in that box. The real evidence was somewhere she'd never find it. Somewhere she'd never think to look. And now that she'd declared war, I had no reason to hold back. I pushed myself off the floor. My sides screamed in protest. I ignored it. I walked to my closet, the one she'd already searched, and pulled out a pair of boots I hadn't worn in years. Old hiking boots. Dirty, worn. The kind of thing my mother would never look twice at. I reached inside the left boot and pulled out a small USB drive. It was warm from being pressed against the leather. I held it in my palm like it was made of gold, because in a way, it was. This USB drive contained everything. Every email, every bank statement, every screenshot, every recording. Years of evidence compressed into a tiny piece of plastic and metal that fit in the palm of my hand. My mother had taken the box because she thought it contained my secrets, but the box was just a distraction, a decoy I'd created years ago, back when I was still scared, back when I still hoped I'd never need to use the real evidence. I'd put old papers in it, copies of things I already had elsewhere. Nothing important, nothing that would hurt me if it was stolen. And my mother had fallen for it. She'd taken the bait. She thought she'd won.
but she just handed me the one thing I'd been waiting for my whole life. Permission. Permission to stop protecting her. Permission to stop making excuses for her. Permission to finally fight back.
I sat on my bed and plugged the USB drive into my laptop. The files loaded quickly. Thousands of documents, hundreds of screenshots, dozens of recordings. I'd been collecting this evidence for 7 years. 7 years of waiting, 7 years of hoping, 7 years of being too scared to pull the trigger. But not anymore. I opened a new document and started writing. I wrote everything, not just the facts, not just the dates and the dollar amounts and the legal violations. I wrote about the pain, the betrayal, the years of manipulation and gaslighting and control. I wrote about the little girl who just wanted her mother to love her. I wrote about the teenager who worked 3 jobs to pay off debts she didn't create. I wrote about the woman who spent 7 years collecting evidence against her own parents because she couldn't trust them to tell the truth. And when I was done writing, I saved the document and made 3 copies, one on the USB drive, one in the cloud, and one that I printed out, folded carefully, and tucked into my wallet, because I wasn't going to let my mother steal this from me. Not this time. Revenge plan. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. My side was sore, my head was pounding, my heart felt like it had been run over by a truck. But I got out of bed anyway, because I had work to do. My mother thought she'd silenced me. She thought she'd destroyed my evidence and stolen my power. She thought I'd curl up in a ball and let her win. She didn't know me at all. The revenge I planned wasn't about anger. It wasn't about hatred. It wasn't about making her suffer the way she'd made me suffer. It was about justice. It was about accountability. It was about finally standing up for the little girl who'd been too scared to speak. And I wasn't going to do it alone. The first person I called was my brother. He's 3 years younger than me. We weren't close growing up. My mother made sure of that. She pitted us against each other, played favorites, used us as weapons in her endless war for control. But as adults, we'd started to find our way back to each other. Slowly, carefully, like 2 survivors of the same shipwreck, learning to trust again. I called him at 6 a.m. He answered on the second ring. "Are you okay?" he asked. No hello, no small talk, just that, because he knew. Somehow, he always knew. "No," I said, "but I will be." I told him everything. About the surgery, about the break-in, about the box and the USB drive, and the years of evidence I'd been collecting. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then he said, "I have something to tell you." My stomach dropped. "What?" "She did it to me too." I don't know why I was surprised. Of course she did it to him too. My mother's need for control didn't discriminate. If you were in her orbit, you were a target. But somehow, I'd convinced myself that my brother was safe, that she'd spared him because he was the golden child, the favorite, the one who could do no wrong. I was wrong. My mother had opened credit cards in his name too, taken out loans, ruined his credit, stolen his future. And he'd been suffering in silence for years, too ashamed to tell anyone. "Why didn't you say something?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Because I thought I was alone," he said. "I thought I was the only one. I thought there was something wrong with me, that I deserved it somehow." I started crying, not silent tears this time, full-on sobbing, the kind of crying that comes from somewhere deep in your chest, somewhere you didn't even know existed. Because I knew exactly how he felt. I'd felt the same way for years. Ashamed, alone, convinced that somehow, some way, I'd brought this on myself. But we weren't alone. We had each other. And together, we were going to make sure no one else ever felt this way again. The plan took 3 weeks to execute. 3 weeks of careful coordination. Late-night phone calls, secret meetings in coffee shops on the other side of town, alibis and cover stories, and lies we told to keep our parents from getting suspicious. My brother handled the financial side. He was better with numbers than I was, more analytical, more patient. He combed through every bank statement, every credit report, every loan document. He found things I'd missed, connections I hadn't seen, patterns that made my blood boil. I handled the legal side. I found a lawyer, a woman named Sarah,
who specialized in financial fraud and family law. She was tough and smart and didn't flinch when I told her my story. "You're not the first person this has happened to," she said, "and you won't be the last, but you can be the one who fights back." She agreed to take our case pro bono. No fees, no charges, just a promise that when we won, we'd pay it forward somehow. Together, we built a case that would destroy our parents. Not physically, not violently, we weren't monsters. But legally, financially, socially, they would never recover. And honestly, they didn't deserve to.
Secret evidence. The evidence was overwhelming. Over 7 years, my parents had opened 14 accounts in my name. Credit cards, store cards, a car loan, 2 student loans, even a mortgage on a rental property they'd bought without my knowledge. The total debt in my name, over $120,000. My brother's numbers were even worse, over $180,000, including a business loan for a company that didn't exist and a line of credit they'd used to renovate their kitchen. Together, our parents had stolen over $300,000 from their own children. $300,000. That's not a mistake. That's not bad luck or poor planning or a few tough years. That's a crime. A deliberate, calculated, sustained crime that they'd committed against the 2 people who trusted them most. And the evidence was ironclad. We had bank statements showing the money flowing from accounts in our names to accounts in theirs. We had emails proving they knew exactly what they were doing. We had recordings of phone calls where they lied to creditors and pretended to be us. We had everything, and we were ready to use it.
But here's the thing about revenge. It's not just about the evidence. It's about the delivery. You can have all the proof in the world, but if you don't present it the right way, it won't tear. People will forget. People will move on. People will convince themselves that it wasn't that bad, that you were overreacting, that family is family, and you should just forgive and forget. I wasn't going to let that happen. I wasn't just going to take my parents to court. I was going to take them to the court of public opinion, because that's what they cared about most. Not money, not freedom, not even their children, their reputation, their image, the way people saw them, and I was going to destroy it. I started with a letter, not a legal letter, not a formal document, a letter, written by hand, on paper, with a pen that kept smudging because my hands were shaking so badly. I wrote it to my parents, but I didn't send it to them. I published it, online, on a website I'd created specifically for this purpose, a website with their names in the title, a website that would come up first when anyone Googled them.
I wrote about everything: the credit cards, the loans, the stolen identities, the lies, the manipulation, the years of gaslighting and control. I wrote about the little girl who just wanted to be loved. I wrote about the teenager who worked 3 jobs to pay off debts she didn't create. I wrote about the woman who spent 7 years collecting evidence against her own parents because she couldn't trust them to tell the truth. And I attached the evidence: every email, every bank statement, every screenshot, every recording, everything. Within 24 hours, the website had been shared over 10,000 times. Within 48 hours, local news stations were calling. Within a week, my parents' faces were on every screen in the city. Public exposure. The public exposure was brutal. Not for me, for them. Because they'd spent their whole lives building this image, this perfect family, this loving couple who'd sacrificed everything for their children. And I just burned it all to the ground. The local news ran a segment called Stolen Futures. They interviewed me and my brother. We told our stories. We showed the evidence. We cried on camera because we couldn't help it. The segment went viral. Millions of views, thousands of comments, people from all over the world sharing their own stories of financial abuse and family betrayal. And my parents? They went into hiding. Not because they were ashamed, not because they regretted what they'd done, because they were scared. Scared of the police, scared of the lawsuits, scared of the neighbors who'd stopped waving and started staring. They didn't apologize. They didn't confess. They didn't take responsibility.
They just disappeared. But you can't hide from the internet, and you can't hide from the truth.
The police arrested my parents 3 weeks after the news segment aired. They were charged with identity theft, fraud, and conspiracy. Dozens of counts. Years in prison if convicted. My mother cried during the arrest. Big, theatrical tears that she probably thought would make people feel sorry for her. They didn't. My father just stared at the ground, silent, defeated, finally facing the consequences of his choices. The judge denied bail, said they were flight risks, said they'd shown no remorse. I watched them being led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, and I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no closure, no joy. Just nothing. Because revenge doesn't fill the hole that betrayal leaves behind. It just makes the hole bigger. Final justice. The trial lasted 2 weeks. My mother hired a fancy lawyer. My father tried to represent himself, a decision that made everyone in the courtroom cringe. The prosecution presented our evidence, page after page, document after document, recording after recording. My mother's lawyer tried to argue that she was mentally ill, that she didn't understand what she was doing, that she was a victim of her own demons. But because the evidence was too clear, too deliberate, too calculated. My mother knew exactly what she was doing. She'd been doing it for years, and she'd enjoyed every second of it. The jury took 4 hours to reach a verdict. Guilty on all counts. My mother was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. My father was sentenced to 8 years. The judge looked at them as he read the sentence and said something I'll never forget. You didn't just steal money from your children. You stole their trust, their security, their sense of safety in the world. That is a crime no amount of time can fully repay, but this is a start. My brother squeezed my hand under the table. I didn't cry. I'd done enough crying. Resolution. It's been 2 years since the trial. My parents are still in prison. My mother sends me letters sometimes. Long, rambling letters full of apologies that feel more like manipulations. I don't read them anymore. I just throw them away. My brother is doing well. He's in therapy. He's rebuilding his credit. He's learning to trust again. It's slow. It's hard. But he's getting there. And me? I'm okay. Not great. Not healed. Not the person I was before. But okay. I still have nightmares sometimes. Still flinch when someone raises their voice. Still struggle to trust people who say they love me. But I'm working on it. And that's enough. I kept the apartment, the one my mother broke into. I thought about moving, about starting fresh somewhere she'd never been, but I decided to stay, because this isn't her space anymore. It's mine. I painted the walls, bought new furniture, burned the coffee mug she left on the counter. I turned the bedroom into an office, put a lock on the door that only I have the key to, and I hung a picture on the wall, a picture of me and my brother, taken the day after the trial. We're both smiling, really smiling, for the first time in years, because even though we lost our parents, we found each other, and that's worth more than all the money in the world. Moral ending. If you're watching this and you recognize something familiar in my story, if you have a parent who takes without asking, who crosses boundaries without permission, who makes you feel like you owe them for being born, I want you to hear something. You don't owe them anything. Not your money, not your time, not your trust, not your silence. You deserve to be safe. You deserve to be respected. You deserve to have boundaries that no one is allowed to cross. And if someone, even someone who's supposed to love you, makes you feel otherwise, they're wrong. My mother broke into my apartment while I was lying in a hospital bed. She thought she'd won. She thought she'd silenced me. She thought she'd stolen my power. But she was wrong. Because the truth is,
No one can steal your power unless you let them. And I was done letting her. So are you.
That's my story. I hope it helps someone out there feel a little less alone. If it did, share it. Leave a comment. Tell me about your own story. Because the only way to break the cycle is to talk about it. And I'm done being silent. Thanks for watching.